The Gulf of Maine had always been both provider and taker. Its waters, cold and deep, yielded bounties of cod, haddock, and lobster to those who respected its moods, and Richard Connolly respected those waters more than most. At 52, his face was a map of decades spent under the northeastern sun, eyes permanently creased from squinting against the glare off the water. April 1993 began like any other spring in the small fishing town of Port Haven, Maine. The harsh winter was finally releasing its grip, and the fleet was eager to make up for lost time. For the Connolly family, fishing wasn't just a profession, it was heritage, passed down through 4 generations. The Atlantic gives, but it demands respect. Richard would often tell his sons, Michael and Thomas, aged 23 and 19. The brothers had grown up on their father's boat, the Northern Star, learning to read the waters, the clouds, and the wind direction before they could even read books. That April morning carried a slight chill as fog rolled across the harbor. The weathered docks creaked under the weight of fishermen preparing for the day ahead. Salt and diesel hung in the air, familiar scents that meant home to the locals. Low-pressure system moving in by evening, Richard advised his sons as they loaded supplies onto their own vessel, the Horizon, a smaller boat he had helped them purchase the previous year. "You boys better be back before 4. "We know, Dad," Michael replied with the confidence of youth. "We're just checking the traps near Bailey Island. We'll be back with a full hold before you even miss us." Thomas, the quieter of the two, simply nodded and continued securing the bait containers. Unlike his brother's easy charm, Thomas possessed a methodical nature that made him an excellent navigator. Together they balanced each other perfectly. Eleanor Connolly, their mother, appeared on the dock with thermoses of coffee and a bag of fresh blueberry muffins. Her worry was visible despite her smile. "Weather Service mentioned fog banks," she said, handing the provisions to Michael. "Mom, we've been navigating fog since we were kids." Michael reassured her with a quick hug. "Besides, we've got the new radio Dad insisted on." Richard joined them, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "Let them go, Ellie. They know what they're doing." But his eyes betrayed the same concern that all fishing families carried, the unspoken acknowledgement that the sea was unpredictable. At 7:15 a.m., the Horizon pulled away from the dock, its white hull soon disappearing into the morning mist. Richard watched until the outline of the boat was completely gone, then turned to prepare his own vessel for the day's work. None of them could have known that this ordinary departure would become the beginning of one of the most perplexing mysteries to ever touch their tight-knit coastal community. By 5:30 p.m., Richard Connolly's concern had transformed into something more urgent. The Horizon should have returned hours ago. The weather had deteriorated as predicted. A thick blanket of fog had settled over the coast, and the wind had picked up considerably from the northeast. "They're not answering the radio," Richard told Eleanor as he paced their kitchen. The house overlooked the harbor, and every few minutes he would stop to scan the gray horizon. "I'm going out to look for them." Eleanor's face paled. "Call the Coast Guard first, Richard." By 6:15 p.m., Richard was back on the Northern Star, accompanied by 2 other fishermen from town, Ben Harper and Joe Mendez, men who had known Michael and Thomas since they were toddlers running along the docks. The Coast Guard had been notified and was dispatching a search vessel, but Richard couldn't wait. The fog made visibility nearly impossible, transforming the familiar coastline into an alien landscape. Richard navigated by instinct as much as by instruments, calling the boys' names into the radio every few minutes. The lack of response echoed more ominously with each attempt. "They might have taken shelter at one of the islands," Ben suggested, as they slowly motored through the gloom. "Signal's bad out here on a clear day. In this soup, it's impossible." But Richard knew his sons wouldn't have gone ashore without radio contact. They were too well trained for that. By midnight, the Coast Guard had expanded the search. Floodlights cut through the darkness as boats methodically combed designated sections of water. Eleanor kept a vigil by the radio at home, fielding calls from concerned neighbors and relaying any information to the search teams. Dawn broke with cruel clarity. The fog had lifted, revealing an empty sea that stretched to the horizon in all directions. 3 Coast Guard vessels, along with a dozen local fishing boats, formed a search pattern that extended from Bailey Island to the offshore fishing grounds. At 10:17 a.m., the call came that stopped Richard's heart. "We've located the Horizon," the Coast Guard officer reported. "It's drifting approximately 8 miles east of Monhegan Island. The vessel appears intact, but there's no one aboard." The Horizon was found with its engine off but in working condition. The fuel tank was half full. The radio was functional. There were no signs of struggle or damage. No indication of what had happened to Michael and Thomas Connolly. Their fishing gear was still neatly stowed. A thermos of coffee remained half full on the small navigation table. The life raft was still secured in its place. The only thing missing was the brothers themselves. The days following the discovery of the empty boat blurred together for Richard Connolly. The Coast Guard conducted an intensive search covering over 1,600 square miles of ocean. Helicopters swept low over the water. Every island, inlet, and rocky outcropping within 20 miles was examined. Nothing was found. "It doesn't make sense," Richard insisted during a meeting with Coast Guard officials a week after the disappearance. "Those boys were raised on boats. They knew protocol. If they went overboard, they would have deployed the life raft. If there was a medical emergency, they would have radioed for help." Commander James Wilson, who had been overseeing the search operation, spread a nautical chart across the table in the Port Haven Community Center. "Mr. Connolly, we've checked current patterns, wind directions, everything. We've interviewed every boat that was in the area that day. No one saw anything unusual." "Then you haven't looked hard enough," Richard replied, his voice strained but determined. Eleanor placed a hand on her husband's arm, but her eyes held the same desperate need for answers. As the official search scaled back after 2 weeks of finding nothing, Richard refused to give up. He took out loans against his house and boat to fund his own search efforts. He reached out to fishing communities up and down the coast, creating a network of vigilant eyes on the water. Port Haven rallied around the Connollys. A fund was established to help with expenses. Fishermen volunteered their time and vessels. Maps were marked with grid patterns, ensuring no area was left unexplored. Richard spent every possible moment at sea, returning home only when exhaustion forced him to rest. Eleanor maintained the logbooks, tracking where they had searched and coordinating with other boats. Their dining room became an operational headquarters, with charts covering the walls and a dedicated phone line for tips and information. "He's going to kill himself out there," Ben Harper confided to Joe Mendez as they watched Richard prepare to head out despite an approaching storm. "He hasn't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in over a month." "Wouldn't you do the same?" Joe replied quietly. Those were his boys. The search consumed Richard. He interviewed every fisherman who worked the Gulf of Maine, asking about currents, about unusual sightings, about anything out of the ordinary. He consulted marine biologists, oceanographers, and even psychics when conventional methods yielded nothing. As summer arrived, bringing calm seas and clear visibility, the hope of finding Michael and Thomas alive had dimmed in the community. But not for Richard and Eleanor. They clung to the stories of miraculous survivals, of fishermen found weeks after disappearing, of people washing up on remote shores. "They're out there," Richard would say each morning as he headed to the docks. "And I'm going to find them." By autumn 1993, the case of the missing Connolly brothers had attracted attention beyond Maine. A feature in a national newspaper brought an influx of calls, most offering sympathy rather than leads. But 3 months after the disappearance, something unusual happened. A fishing trawler from Nova Scotia reported finding a waterproof bag floating nearly 60 miles northeast of the Horizon's last known position. Inside was a first aid kit with Horizon written on the underside in Thomas's neat handwriting. "This doesn't make sense," Detective Sarah Harlow said, examining the kit in the small Port Haven police station. She had been assigned to the case when it became clear this was more than a typical maritime accident. The currents don't flow in that direction. And why would this be the only item that surfaced? Richard stared at the familiar green bag. Thomas was always organized. "He packed that kit himself, Mr. Connolly," Detective Harlow said carefully. "We need to consider all possibilities. Is there any reason someone might want to harm your sons?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. "My boys were good men," Richard replied firmly. Everyone in town knew them, respected them. But the discovery forced uncomfortable questions into the open. Port Haven was small, just over 2,000 residents, but like any community, it had its secrets. As Detective Harlow began investigating the brothers' personal lives, rumors and whispers emerged. Thomas had apparently been seeing Jenny Morgan, the daughter of Henry Morgan, owner of the competing seafood processing plant. The relationship had been kept quiet due to the long-standing tension between the two families over fishing territories. Michael had been overheard arguing with Caleb Dawson, a boat mechanic, just days before the disappearance. Witnesses described it as heated, though no one could recall the specific cause. "They're trying to muddy the waters," Eleanor said angrily when these stories reached her, "making it sound like our boys were mixed up in something wrong." But Richard was willing to explore any avenue that might lead to answers. He sat with Detective Harlow for hours, painfully examining every aspect of his son's lives. Michael was saving to buy a larger boat, he recalled. He had almost $15,000 in his account. Thomas was talking about community college in the fall, marine biology. As Detective Harlow investigated these new angles, another strange development occurred. A lobsterman reported that his traps, set in the deep channel east of Monhegan Island, had caught something unusual, a waterlogged disposable camera. Against all odds, the film was partially salvageable. Most images were ruined, but 3 photographs remained somewhat visible. They showed what appeared to be the deck of the Horizon. The timestamp indicated they had been taken on the morning of the disappearance. In the final blurry image, something indistinct appeared on the horizon, a shape that could have been another vessel, though it was impossible to identify with certainty. Someone else was out there with them, Richard insisted, studying the grainy enlargement until his eyes burned. Someone who hasn't come forward. The discovery of the camera reinvigorated the investigation. Coast Guard records were reviewed again. Every boat known to be in the area was identified and its crew interviewed, but the mysterious vessel, if that's what it was, remained elusive. Winter descended on Port Haven, bringing with it fierce storms and treacherous seas. Richard was forced to scale back his search, though he still ventured out whenever conditions allowed. The not knowing was a wound that refused to heal. 1 year after the disappearance, life in Port Haven had developed a new normal. The Northern Star remained docked more often than not, as Richard divided his time between occasional fishing trips and his continuing search. Eleanor had returned to her job at the town library, finding some solace in the routine and the quiet support of the community. The investigation had grown cold. Detective Harlow still checked in regularly, but new leads had dried up months ago. The case file remained open, but active pursuit of answers had dwindled. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope addressed to Richard and Eleanor Connolly, postmarked from Portland, Maine. Inside was a single page with a typed message. Not all is as it seems in the disappearance of your sons. Look to the depths where secrets lie. April 12, 1989. The date meant nothing to Richard or Eleanor. When they showed the letter to Detective Harlow, she immediately had it analyzed for fingerprints and traced the paper stock. Both efforts led nowhere. April 12, 1989, Richard repeated, poring over old logbooks and calendars. What happened that day? The question led him to the Port Haven Gazette archives, where he and Eleanor spent hours reviewing microfiche of old newspapers. Nothing significant appeared to have happened locally on that date. It was Joe Mendez who made the connection. That was when the Delia May went down, he said when Richard mentioned the date. Remember? That research vessel that sank during a storm about 15 miles off Pemaquid Point. Richard vaguely recalled the incident. A marine research ship that had been studying Gulf of Maine ecosystems had been caught in an unexpected squall. All hands had been rescued, but the vessel was lost. What would that have to do with Michael and Thomas? Eleanor asked. The question prompted Richard to dig deeper. He contacted the Oceanographic Institute that had operated the Delia May and learned something interesting. The ship had been mapping unusual formations on the seabed, including what they believed might be previously undocumented shipwrecks. The research was classified for some reason, Richard told Detective Harlow. They wouldn't tell me exactly what they found. This new thread led to a surprising connection. Thomas's girlfriend, Jenny Morgan, had a brother who worked for a salvage company based in Portland. When questioned, Jenny revealed that Thomas had been asking questions about deep-sea salvage operations shortly before his disappearance. He was curious about how salvage rights work, Jenny explained, her eyes downcast. He asked if an ordinary fisherman could claim something they found underwater. Detective Harlow pulled Coast Guard mapping records and overlaid them with the Horizon's last known coordinates. The area where the brothers had vanished was approximately 12 miles from where the Delia May had been conducting its research before sinking. You think they found something? Detective Harlow said to Richard. It wasn't a question. I think they stumbled onto something someone didn't want found, Richard replied, the pieces finally beginning to form a coherent picture in his mind. With renewed purpose, Richard approached the Coast Guard about conducting a deep-sea survey of the area. Initially reluctant, they eventually agreed when the state police added their formal request based on Detective Harlow's investigation. In June 1994, 14 months after the disappearance, a specialized research vessel equipped with sonar technology began mapping the seabed where the Horizon had been found drifting. 3 days into the survey, they detected something. The sonar had identified what appeared to be a previously undocumented shipwreck, lying in approximately 270 feet of water. Initial surveys suggested it was old, possibly dating back to the 19th century. "This could be what they found," Richard said, studying the sonar images with intense focus. "This could be why they disappeared." The discovery prompted the involvement of the Maine Historical Preservation Commission and, unexpectedly, federal authorities. The location was placed under restricted access while a proper archaeological assessment could be arranged. Richard fought against the bureaucracy, insisting on being present for any exploration of the site. After weeks of argument and the intervention of their state senator, he was allowed to accompany the dive team as an observer. On a clear August morning in 1994, Richard stood on the deck of the research vessel Oceanic Explorer as professional divers prepared to descend to the wreck. The waiting was almost unbearable. Each minute stretched like an hour as he imagined what might be discovered below. When the divers finally surfaced after nearly 2 hours underwater, their findings changed everything. The wreck was indeed from the 19th century, a merchant vessel that appeared to have sunk around 1850, but that wasn't all they found. Scattered near the wreck were modern items: a flashlight with Horizon etched on the handle, a diving mask, and most significantly, a waterproof notebook. The notebook, though damaged, contained entries in Thomas's handwriting. The final dated entry was from April 15, 1993, the day after they had disappeared. "We found it yesterday," Thomas had written, just like the old stories said. "The Meridian with its cargo still aboard. M is ecstatic. Going to dive again today for proof before we report it. Someone else is interested too. Saw another boat yesterday watching from a distance." The Meridian, Richard would later learn, was a merchant ship that had disappeared in 1851 while reportedly carrying a shipment of gold coins from Boston to Halifax. Its location had been the subject of local legend for generations. The evidence suggested a scenario that was both simple and tragic. The brothers had somehow learned about the possible location of the wreck, perhaps from old family stories or local folklore. They had been secretly searching for it and finally found it. But someone else had been searching too. The investigation shifted dramatically. Marine historians confirmed that the wreck was indeed likely to be the Meridian, and preliminary surveys indicated the presence of valuable cargo. The federal involvement was explained. Any treasure recovered would be subject to complex salvage laws. Detective Harlow focused on identifying the mysterious vessel seen in the recovered photograph. With a clearer purpose, she re-interviewed witnesses and reviewed shipping records with renewed intensity. 3 months later, her persistence paid off. A commercial fisherman from Portsmouth admitted that he had seen another boat in the area on the day of the disappearance, a vessel he recognized as belonging to a man named Victor Krantz, known in maritime circles as a treasure hunter, who operated in legally dubious ways. Krantz was located in Florida and brought in for questioning. Though he initially denied any involvement, the evidence against him mounted. His boat's GPS records, which he had failed to completely erase, showed him in the vicinity of the Horizon on that fateful day. Finally, faced with mounting evidence, Krantz confessed. He had been following the same historical leads about the Meridian for years. When he saw the Connolly brothers apparently making a discovery, he approached them. What began as a confrontation over salvage rights escalated. In the struggle that followed, both brothers ended up in the water. "It was an accident," Krantz insisted. "I tried to help them, but the current was too strong. They were just gone." Whether this was the full truth would never be known. Krantz was charged with involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The investigation concluded that Michael and Thomas Connolly had died at sea that day, their bodies carried away by the powerful Gulf of Maine currents. For Richard and Eleanor, the resolution brought a measure of closure, if not peace. The Meridian was declared a protected historical site, and a portion of the recovered artifacts were displayed at the Port Haven Maritime Museum, with a permanent exhibition dedicated to Michael and Thomas Connolly. Richard never returned to full-time fishing. Instead, he channeled his energies into maritime safety advocacy, working to improve emergency procedures and communication systems for small fishing vessels. On the 1-year anniversary of solving the mystery, Richard stood at the bow of the Northern Star as he scattered flowers over the water near where his sons had last been seen. The Gulf of Maine stretched before him, still powerful, still mysterious, but now also a resting place. They found their treasure, he whispered to the wind. They just never knew how much it would cost. In Port Haven, the story of the Connolly brothers became part of local lore, a tale of adventure, tragedy, and a father's unyielding determination to discover the truth, no matter how deep it lay beneath the surface.